Right on. Okay, Paula asked me to give this talk, and she asked me to start with an introduction. So my name is Oz, and I first got interested in these ideas. Mainly, it's directly through reading Robert Anton Wilson back when I was in my early 20s. And he says that he writes in the Hermetic style. So this presentation is going to is from the perspective of that, the Hermetic Sciences. Anyway, I went to a talk of Robert Anton Wilson's once in New York, and there was a book there on their vendor's table called The Lazy Man's Guide to Death and Dying. And it was on that table because Robert Anton Wilson had written an introduction, and that, of course, was by E.J. Gold. And that was kind of my first knowing purchase of an E.J. Gold book, because around that time I had also purchased The Secret Talks of Mr. G, thinking it was by Gurdjieff or by a Gurdjieff group. Anyway, this was in 1983, and it eventually led me to joining study groups around studying the ideas of E.J. Gold with Jimmy Accardi in the later 80s. And then I moved out to California, and I realized from my point of view that it was a continuation of this Hermetic Sciences that I'd started studying under Wilson. And by Hermetic Sciences, it's not a brand name, it's just kind of a loose reference to a tradition, a collection of traditions that includes alchemy, Rosicrucianism, magic, Kabbalah, and it's sort of, as it's gone along, it's expanded. So elements like the Theosophical Society brought in elements of Hinduism, and later, Buddhism came to be part of it, etc. Sufism. Hermeticism, it comes from a mythical figure named Hermes Trismegistus, who probably didn't exist, but he is said to be a combination of the Egyptian god Thoth, who is said to introduce writing and science and magic to the world. And it combines Thoth with a Greek god, Hermes. And Hermes is the messenger of the gods, and go between the gods. Hermes is also considered a psychopomp, which means someone who is a guide through the land of the dead. There's another aspect of the Hermetic Sciences, which has to do with when we say something has a Hermetic seal. And this applies both to what we want to put around our work so it can develop, but also it has to do with how Hermetic information gets communicated. And this has to do with the subject of this workshop, language of the heart, because, well, first of all, language of the heart implies the division of the machine into three basic territories, which is the territory of the physical or the moving centrum, the territory of the intellect, the mind, and the territory of the emotions, the feeling centrum. And these they all work together, obviously, but they're very different territories with the very different aspects to them. We sometimes don't, so they're sometimes called brains or centrums. And I just want to make the point that we know how vast the intellect is and what it can do with universities and all the things we can learn and study. And we sometimes don't bring that sort of complexity into consideration with the feeling centrum, because in our culture, it's sort of almost often in the popular culture, it gets reduced to romanticism and sexuality and all that, and love is just kind of confined to that definition mostly, but it's a huge territory. So it's going to have its own language, which is not the same language as the intellectual language for the thinking centrum. And it's also going to have its own set of problems, and solving these problems is part of the work that we're doing. So in Hermetic communication, when it's trying to create a language of the heart, it's not communicating. The language is not the same as the language of the thinking centrum. It's not our normal language, and it tends to, the information comes to us more indirectly, and it's up to us to unlock it, to unlock the Hermetic seal one way or another, to dig out this communication and receive this language. So that's a whole art in itself, and that art is explored, the best that I know of, in E.J. Gould's book, Visions in the Stone, where he writes about unlocking artifacts, and it's these artifacts that communicate Hermetic information. Another part of the Hermetic tradition concerns something called Freemasonry. I'm not a Freemason, but a Mason is someone who obviously builds something. It's a builder. So one of their central metaphors is that the Masons are building the Temple of Jerusalem, King Solomon's temple. And that is a metaphor, I believe, for the production of a soul. And we'll go into that in more detail. So this is one of the aspects, one of the most important aspects of the Hermetic sciences, is that you have to initiate yourself. You can be given all this information, you can do all these things, but it's not until you actually experience the realizations yourself and then take it from there that you've been initiated into it. It's got to come from your own work, rather than someone just can't give you an instruction and then you do it and it's there, because that would be just directly giving it to the thinking centrum, and we need the sort of feeling centrum to realize these things on its own. So this metaphor of the Masons constructing a temple, producing a soul, sort of leads us to infer that our path, the way that we are going to construct our own temple, is just that. It's a construction. We take elements from different systems or things or artifacts that appeal to us, and we unlock those and we put them together in our own way. So a language of the heart is therefore going to be a little bit different for everyone, because everyone has different interests and everyone is a different type, and certain things are going to be easier for some people to unlock than other things. Okay, so I just want to, one of the, so if you look at the work of EJ's work, as if you ask what is the curriculum of it, like if you were a new person and you were to come to this school and they'll say, well, what's the course? And I would suggest that it starts with what we call HBM, which is the Human Biological Machine as a Transformational Apparatus, that book. And the second book in that course, and I'm going by, there was a series of books put out called The Secret Talks. This is what I'm basing this curriculum on. And the second book in that series is called Practical Work on Self. And the first chapter of that is extremely important. It's almost a central part of the curriculum, in my opinion. And I'm just going to I'm going to talk a little bit about that chapter, but first I want to start with a short quote from it. And this is on page 6 in Practical Work on Self, and I want you to remember that this is on page 6. Here's the quote. Because a sleeping machine cannot function as a transformational apparatus, the soul, which is solely and entirely a product of transformation, cannot form. And even if it could, without the foundation and, quote, food, unquote, for evolution, it could not evolve. If we had the will to awaken the machine, only then could life have any meaning. Okay, so so the word "the soul" is a little bit vague. In other words, it's not something that normally we can easily grasp of what that means. It sounds supernatural. It's, our deep self, our essential self, that which survives death. But we're going to look at that in a second. So again, this is a very important chapter, and it's well worth forming a group and studying this chapter for a week or two at a time and paragraph by paragraph. But the technique that is given here it's called the popcorn exercise, and it's intended to have the centrums I mentioned functioning properly. And it's posited that the emotional centrum, as we normally know it, is basically, however you want to put it, asleep or not functioning or not active, or it's just concerned with lower emotions, with negative emotions. And so the technique that EJ gives here is what he calls the transference of the head brain with the tail brain. By the head brain, he's meaning the intellectual centrum, our normal thinking, our normal associative thinking. And the tail brain, he means the moving centrum. And he says that when that transference occurs, then the centrums are functioning properly. In other words, the emotional centrum is now coming to life, or the heart is being opened. And I say in other words because he does not explicitly say that, although it is implied. Now, we're talking about a language for the heart, and this chapter is obviously communicated in intellectual language, and it's directed to the thinking centrum. And so what I get from that is that you cannot directly tell the heart to wake up, that it doesn't respond to language directly in that fashion. And so a lot of teachers and philosophers perform their ideas in their writing, besides just explicitly writing it. And so I would suggest that this is being performed in the same way so the technique of placing the head brain attention on the moving centrum, the idea of that is it's supposed to, by bringing all your attention to bear upon that, it's such a complex thing for the thinking centrum to do that it kind of overloads it, that it bypasses the associative thinking. And then in that way, the transference occurs and the heart becomes alive, is awakened a little bit more. So if you were to use this idea of reversing perspectives or transferring one function to the other, if you look at what he's saying in reverse, he's saying the intellectual centrum goes to the moving centrum and then the heart gets open. While you can look at it the opposite way. If you try to open the heart and you do that, well, then, maybe the intellectual centrum will be naturally more inclined to operate properly, and the moving centrum as a thinking centrum. Now, so the fact that we cannot communicate directly to the emotional centrum with words leads to the question of how does it receive communication? And also I want to stress that the language of the heart goes both ways, so that it's developing a language where you receive information, but it's also you're working for a language of communicating it. So transmitting it, receiving it, and also transmitting it. So one way we can receive this sort of encoded hermetic information is through what's called signs. And we receive information from signs like nonverbal signs or indirectly verbal signs all the time. And one very basic example would be if you are hungry and you go to your fridge late at night and there's a piece of cheese in there that's been there for a while, you're not sure how long and you're not sure if it's edible, and you look at it and you look for signs of mold on it. Maybe you don't see any, so you smell it and it smells kind of off to you. So that's a sign to you that you shouldn't eat that cheese. And I'm deliberately using a food metaphor because he mentioned food in the quote that I read, that we're kind of, in terms of the language, we're kind of looking for food to grow our soul. And so one excellent system of signs and symbols, so this is what we're saying is going to communicate, is going to create a language of the heart, or one aspect of the language of the heart is through signs and symbols. And one great foundational tool of the Hermetic Sciences is called Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is thought to be extremely difficult and complex, like literally learning a whole new language. And indeed, it does get that way. And one reason it gets that way is because it's intended to do the same thing as the popcorn exercise. It's intended to overload the associative intellectual thinking. So all of a sudden it kind of gives up, and hopefully your heart gets opened a little bit by it. But it doesn't, you can start utilizing Kabbalah without it getting that complex and without it being difficult, because the word Kabbalah itself means reception. So it's obvious we're trying to receive more of this Hermetic information. Another definition given by Robert Anton Wilson of Kabbalah is multiple vision. So we're trying to receive multiple vision. We're trying to take in more input from the environment. And when I say the environment, we're always, we're never without an environment. We're never without our own world around us. And the world that we perceive, as has been said many times, is a construction of our brain. We receive this energetic input through our senses, and then we make a picture out of it with our brains. And so receiving signs from the environment could be thought like as receiving signs from a different part of yourself or a part of your subconscious, because the way you're encountering the environment, you are constructing it. You're constructing your own view. So this is again a a fundamental principle of Hermeticism is that there are hierarchies of consciousness. So, and that means that there are gradations of consciousness below and above the human one. So if we, temporarily try that belief, then there could be agencies that are using, that are communicating us through our environment, through signs and symbols. Carl Jung, who explored, he was the Swiss psychologist, former colleague of Sigmund Freud's, who studied Hermeticism significantly. He said that that's how the subconscious mind communicates to us, is through symbols. Okay, so to start with Kabbalah, it's reception and multiple vision, and the word vision it doesn't just mean things that we see. It can be, other kinds of audible visions or whatever, different, just expanding what we're taking in. And the first correspondence, the only, what I suggest beginning with, and very much relevant to the topic today, is the central sphere on the tree of life, which is called Tifereth. And this sphere corresponds to the heart chakra. And once we, if we look at a Kabbalistic dictionary and we see what corresponds to Tifereth, it gives us much more of a bigger vision of what the territory of the heart or the heart chakra encompasses. For instance, we, the deities, Jesus, Buddha, Osiris, Krishna, they all correspond to this same territory, so we can correlate different teachings from different systems in that way to, this is again learning the language of what we're going to receive from this. And so one thing we know, so in this way, I mean, to me, it helps if you are not a member of an organized religion, when you hear the word Jesus, you can, if you're not a Christian, you don't have to be a Christian to realize that, they're talking about Tifereth. They're talking about this territory rather than a historical figure. And Jesus taught in parables. And so it is using language, but not directly. And it requires a parable, or an allegory has that condition that we talked about, where you have to figure it out. You have to get the realization, you're given the parable, but you have to unlock that parable to get the realization of what it's communicating, if anything. And also here, I want to just interject for a minute the idea of skepticism, because when we start looking at things along these lines, not everything is a sign. And we know from either reading Gurdjieff or from other sources that we are prone to self-deception. That is, we are prone to looking for what we want to see. And what can really help us get around that, or be careful of that, is self-observation, which is emphasized and introduced in the HBM, and there's exercises in there to develop that faculty of self-observation. And so if we consider the environment as part of ourselves, we're also carefully observing the environment and being skeptical, is this really a sign? Is it not? One thing that can help confirm or deny that are significant coincidences, which are synchronicities. If we experience a coincidence, and again, I mean, there's a trope in occultism that there are no coincidences. And I don't agree with that, because I think there are some things that do coincide and they're just merely coincidences. They're not a sign or a synchronicity. They're not a meaningful coincidence. And but we do experience coincidences. I mean, we do experience synchronicities, and that is another way. That's another sign that's can be pointing our attention in a particular way to receive a particular type of information, or receiving a communication from this language of the heart. So back to the idea that we're looking for food as part of this language, and Gurdjieff delineated the 3 types of food for the different brains or the different centrums, which is what we ordinarily think of as food for the moving centrum, the physical centrum, impressions for the intellectual center, the thinking centrum. And then it's said that the food for the emotional centrum is they call it prana, or it's in the air. Again, I am giving this talk is all directed toward the intellect. So when Gurdjieff or people in that tradition are saying it's prana, it's in the air, that's still extremely vague. But they tell us it has to be, and I believe I've read this in EJ's writings, that the prana, or this vital element, prana sort of indicates a vital element within the air, has to be extracted. Again, getting back to the idea of unlocking something. And there is I don't remember where it is, some industrious person could maybe look it up, where EJ gives a prayer for unlocking the prana. And this prayer has to do with, I don't remember it exactly, but it has to do with evoking a higher emotion. It's something to do about compassion for everyone, or it could be like a higher form of like a pity for everyone, or that kind of a higher emotion. Now, I think that this vital principle, this we're vaguely calling prana for the moment, is not simply in the air, that perhaps, and I'm speculating a little bit, that it's an expression in the air, meaning it's not right there. It's not something we can reach out and grab. So for instance, I believe that this kind of vital energy can come not only from doing breathing exercises, which, by the way, EJ doesn't even teach breathing exercises. Gurdjieff did not publicly teach breathing exercises. EJ's mentioned breathing exercises, or regulating your breathing in terms of playing a flute or playing a recorder. But so there must be other ways to extract this vital force. It's being called prana. And I believe it also comes through art in the biggest sense, meaning painting, music, literature, anything along those lines, music, obviously. And let's see. So I study a Hermetic style philosopher named Gilles Deleuze, and he uses the term sense as the vital principle. So he has a book that I'm going through and explicating, called The Logic of Sense. And so sense, not just in the terms of meaning, but in this sort of vital, life-affirming principle. And one of the things that that I find important and central to his thesis is that nonsense can provide a donation of sense. Okay. Now, what this means is that one way that this food for the feeling centrum, this sense, can be communicated is through humor. And I think humor, we tend to laugh it off. I mean, we don't think it's as serious as sitting down and, doing seated meditation or a prayer or something like that. It's seen to be frivolous. But you'll notice, one of EJ's main ways of communicating his teaching is through humor. And humor has that attribute that we talked about earlier of by producing a form of nonsense, it's sort of slightly bypassing the mind, because all of a sudden, like, you hear something ridiculous and you go, oh, well, this isn't, this isn't for the mind. And so in that way, maybe the mind is turned off, or you're not taking it as seriously. You're not trying to figure it out with the head, and you're just receiving this sense that's communicated with the nonsense, often in terms of like a parable or an allegory, or, again, something that you want to unlock somehow to get the full sense of it. So, it's a huge thing to start applying Kabbalah just very basically with learning the correspondences of Tifereth, because there are even, okay, well, before I get to that, when we talked about multiple vision and reception, another aspect of that is thinking in terms of multiple meanings or puns. So hearing words and thinking, well, there might be another level of meaning to it. When Idries Shah is writing about the Sufis, he says that Sufi teachers communicate on at least seven different levels. And again, we don't need to figure out what each of these levels are, but just the idea that there's multiple meaning, puns can be a way of accessing this multiple vision. So learning of the correspondences of Tifereth, we learn that the word associated with Tifereth, with the heart centrum, is beauty. And, if you didn't know, if you now know that, then this quote from the philosopher Nietzsche, you hear it in a different way. He says, to affirm life is to experience life as a whole as beautiful. So we know the word beauty corresponds to Tifereth, and it gives a whole new light to this quote. So the way, and again, these signs and symbols are sometimes childishly obvious. And I'll give an example of that. This is a Valentine's Day workshop. And, when we hear the word Valentine, or when we think of a Valentine, immediately the image of a big red heart comes to mind. So, and because that's, in the popular form of Valentine's Day, it's a whole romantic thing of, opening the heart to romance and all that, but we are not going the ordinary way, and we're thinking in terms of puns. So for us Hermetic Kabbalists, Valentine to us means Tifereth. It's an obvious, it's a very, direct connection with Tifereth, because immediately we get this image of a heart. Now, just like about a week ago, I was looking for film for Paula and I to watch. And I came across an old classic, a sort of Saturday Night Live type of comedy called Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd and others. And I remember this movie was on the Institute's list, and I hadn't seen it for a long time. And I know Paula hasn't seen a lot of the American comedy classics, so we decided to watch it. And lo and behold, the main character, Eddie Murphy's character, his name is Billy Ray Valentine. So right there we have, you don't need to be a genius to connect Valentine with Tifereth. It's all of a sudden right there. And then, we see the clothes he's wearing, and we see obviously someone, the writers of that, there are some times where Kabbalah gets invoked into a creative piece of work, like a film, more or less without the writers being consciously aware of that. But there are other times where it seems pretty clear, or I would say there's a high probability that the writers were deliberately putting these kinds of signs in. So this movie, Trading Places, it has a great deal. It communicates in the language of the heart, and it has a great deal to communicate. For instance, it's a movie about reversing perspectives. Reversing perspectives is a skill that you're trained to do in the Hermetic Sciences. And I gave an example of that earlier when looking at the popcorn exercise and reversing the perspective on how that was presented. So the story of Trading Places, and I do recommend that people see it at some point. The story is that a very wealthy person gets put in a very poor person's position, and vice versa. A street beggar, who's Eddie Murphy, gets elevated to running this big company. And the lesson of learning, of reversing perspectives, is that it educates the heart to be more empathetic, whatever that word is, empathetic, show empathy to a perspective outside of their own. And these guys are getting it because they're living it. But so that's one of the lessons there. There are other extremely obvious signs along these lines, and I won't do a complete spoiler, but that's one example. Another example of the word Valentine as a tag for Tifereth is in a book that was high up on the reading list. I say high up because there was a list put out by the Real World Catalog, and it was number 2 or 3 on that list. And that book is by Robert Heinlein, and it's called Stranger in a Strange Land. And the main character of that is Valentine Michael Smith. And Heinlein's widow, in a something she wrote for an expanded edition, an expanded posthumous edition of Stranger in a Strange Land, said that he deliberately chose symbolic names. So the names have a significance in that book. So Valentine, we've already talked about. Michael, if you get a little bit more into Kabbalistic symbolism, not that much more, but a little bit more, corresponds with the Archangel Michael. And there are 4 archangels that correspond to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And Michael happens to correspond to the element fire. So we have heart, we have fire, and we have, this last name is Smith. And Smith is a symbol for everyone, everyone. So one obvious meaning of this name is set the heart on fire. And so if we take that as one sense of this book, then we can, we read the book and there's a great deal of helpful information for navigating and constructing navigating the territory of the heart and the process of constructing a soul. Now, soul is another, like I mentioned earlier, it can be like a vague, almost supernatural sounding term. But in this book, The Logic of Sense, which is based on the two main influences are the Stoic philosophers and Lewis Carroll. And the Stoic philosophers wrote about the soul, and their conception of the soul is that the soul, the dominant aspect of the soul is the heart. So that really gives us a place to start from when we're talking about the soul. It's something like we all know where our heart is located, and we know I've had strong feelings at one point or another. So it gives us kind of a place when we talk about the soul while we're still alive. We're talking about starting from, there, from the higher emotional center connected to the deep self. And we, this gets a little bit affirmed if we look at the writings of what's been called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And, in terms of connecting the heart with this aspect of ourselves, with our essential self that survives physical death, that all of the instruction in the Egyptian Book of the Dead after the body has died, it's really about uniting the soul with Osiris. So the departed, the Egyptians have delineations of different aspects of it, but the intention or the goal is to unite yourself with Osiris. And we know from Kabbalah that Osiris means Tifereth. So that's the instruction in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and that's the connection between the heart and the soul, that the heart is sort of the soul in its embryonic stage. So you can get deeper into this. This is a beginning, but some very influential Hermetic scientists back around the turn of the 20th century were known as the Order of the Golden Dawn. And they were in England, and they were an extreme influence on everything I'm talking about in magic and throughout the 20th century and still continuing. And because what they did, they took a lot of these old Hermetic texts and stuff, and they came up with new rituals. And one of the things they kind of modified for their own purposes was a book called the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. And the part of that I'm most concerned with in this talk is he talks about the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And part of the reason the Golden Dawn adopted this and continued this kind of archaic terminology is this fact that holy guardian angel in our modern times doesn't really make sense to our minds, to our intellect. So we don't need to try to figure out what it is. The holy guardian angel, as it's been presented, has been presented in paradoxical style or in multiple ways. So one, sometimes it's presented as our higher self. Sometimes it's presented as literally an angelic intelligence outside of ourselves. And sometimes it's presented as like our higher self as an aspect of our subconscious mind. So the knowledge and conversation in that model of it is to knowledge of our subconscious mind and conversation, or in other words, to make the subconscious mind more conscious. So this union, this knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel is said to be an operation in Tifereth. So in other words, one way of looking at it is that they're creating what do you call an anthropomorphic form externalized of the intelligence of the heart. So, you know, the conversation with the holy guardian angel comes along, you know, is connected with this idea of a language of the heart. And it is, again, a two-way conversation in that you receive things through signs and symbols, through dreams or through coincidences, or, you know, through things you see in the environment that you are interpreting in a non-ordinary way. I'll also say that we're not totally dependent on passively looking for signs or waiting until we receive them. We can generate our own signs through using oracles. Like the tarot is like a very fundamental aspect of the Hermetic Sciences. The I Ching, you can ask a question of the tarot, and and that's also extremely, you know, connected with Kabbalah. It's another way of using Kabbalah. It's another way of receiving multiple visions. But so let's see, where was I going with that? What's that? Okay, I lost that train, but we'll probably circle around back to it. The logic of sense from Deleuze also has the same attribute that we talked about in the popcorn exercise, which is that it's a series of paradoxes. And Deleuze also performs his philosophy in that book. And he states right out front, it's a series of paradoxes. And he even, in the writing, he puts paradoxes within paradoxes. So in other words, he's doing these kind of literary tricks to bypass the associative mind, which is what we're looking for in receiving this kind of communication. So I was talking about the holy guardian angel. Yes, again, it's like the holy guardian angel itself is almost synonymous with the territory of Tifereth, with the heart. So one aspect of it, it's said to be the epitome of your true will. The holy guardian angel, or this intelligence of the heart, is the epitome of your true self. So when you are united with it, you are aligned with your true self. So, you know, one very simple way of just looking at this is that to tell if you are in alignment, if you are thinking along these terms of all I've said, is love what you do. If you love what you do, and if you are doing what you love, and again, love in the broadest sense, in terms of agape, or brotherly love, philia. These are different kinds of love that the Greeks delineated. Then, you know, you are aligning to your path. It's part of the construction your temple, of your spiritual path. How much time is? What's that? 10 minutes, okay. But again, if we're using this model of the holy guardian angel, it doesn't come all at once. It's a progressive determination. It's a progressive journey, and it starts at the culmination of it is said to be the union of the microcosm with the macrocosm, or it's very similar to what the yogis called samadhi, which is or Deleuze calls it the breaking the syntactical link with the world, which means breaking how we tend to, this is again getting past the associative mind, breaking how we tend to translate everything into language, into words. And this syntactical link is also has to do with language, with how we're conditioned to think in terms of a subject and a predicate. And normally we think of ourselves as the subject and the world as the predicate. Well, if you break that link, you're breaking that separation between, it's a union of yourself with the world. But that's at the sort of the epitome of the union with the holy guardian angel. It starts out much simpler. You can conceive of the holy guardian angel as a guide, as an agency that is aligning things through coincidences and synchronicities and serendipitous things, and just fortuitous aspects that give us the information for this construction of a temple. Now, I talked about the communication is two ways. We're not only receiving, but we are wanting to communicate. And one way we communicate is through our efforts, through doing stuff. When you construct something, you just don't receive all the instructions of how to do it, but you do something with those. You do the exercises, do the work. That's one way. Often, when you get into this deeply, you will, you can devise an experiment of a kind of a work, and then you can try to receive some feedback from the universe, feedback from the environment. You could, even like ask the tarot, do a one-card tarot draw. How is my work? How is the work I just did? Because we're basically working in areas that are largely unknown to us. And so this is, again, trying to establish this communication of things beyond our, what's immediately given to our knowledge. Another way, in terms of this food for the emotional centrum being in works of art and music and all that, is to be creative, to do creative experiments, or just experiment with being creative in any way. Like one of the exercises in the Institute is to practice a musical instrument for 5 minutes a day. And, we can, that is giving our head brains something to do other than associative thinking. And it's, we're trying to feel the music. It's just, that's one way I believe we have of, Beethoven communicated from his heart with his symphonies, and, just going for low-hanging fruit, we can put on his 9th symphony, the climactic part of it, the Ode to Joy. It's been written up as, and hear his creativity. but also ourselves. We can write a song, write a poem, draw something. Any of that is communicating when you're trying to really do it. That is, when you're not thinking of something else, or you're not doing it for because you have to do it for a commercial or something like that. When you're truly trying to be creative, this is a way of you are expressing information from that aspect of, from the feeling centrum. Okay, I believe that there's an exercise in the human biological machine that is helps us to start this process of communicating from the heart, and that exercise is called warming the soul. And I just want to end the main part of this talk and then open it up to questions for a few minutes after that. I'm not going to read the whole exercise, but I'll read some of it. You can follow along and attempt to do it as much as possible in this space. Okay. It begins. There's some preliminaries to it, but I'll just start right the paragraph before the actual exercise. And EJ writes, let us try to experience what it will be like to polish the diamond once the psychological and emotional matrix has been removed. And okay. We will imagine ourselves sitting cross-legged, holding a heavy ball of cold clay gently and lovingly in our cupped hands. As our attention comes to rest upon the clay, we will imagine ourselves to have somehow suddenly ascended from one of the lower dimensions into a higher state, in which the whole universe is visible, and to have taken the form of this clay which we now cradle in our hands. Somehow, we do not know quite how, although only moments ago we were convinced that we were on the planet Earth, we now find ourselves viewing the universe from the outside. In our present exalted state, we vaguely remember that if this clay is the universe, then its interior must be filled with trillions upon trillions of luminous bodies, stars, and planets suspended in space, speeding outward away from one another by the force of mutually repellent gravitational fields, and that somewhere within this little universe is the almost unthinkably minuscule star around which our most recent place of habitation, the planet Earth, revolves. We know that even with the aid of very big telescopes, those remaining inside the universe cannot see us outside the boundary of the clay, because within the boundaries of the universe, the light bends and reflects, curving back upon itself. The inside is entirely dark except for the pinpoint brightness of little stars swirling in their galactic clusters. Although it looks small to us now, we know that the distance across this little clay cosmos we hold in our hands is many light years. We ourselves are connected in some way to this little universe. Our consciousness flows through both forms, the creator and the creation, like a smoky vapor. Now we are going to imagine that we very intensely regard this little clay cosmos in our hands. If we were still in the lower dimension, we would call this substance clay because it comes from the earth. Okay, so the exercise continues on, and a lot of what the following paragraphs have to do with concentrating our full attention. bringing our full attention to bear upon this, this ball of clay. And then more towards the conclusion of the exercise, he writes, we suddenly recognize that this object, because it is the object of the totality of our collected and concentrated attention, is now actually the sum total of our whole attention, of which we are the source, that we are now looking at a living embodiment of our attention. This clay substance, when infused with the whole of our attention, is called the soul, which we hope to help to grow, evolve, and infuse with life. He talks a little bit about the soul and about this process, and then he says, the soul is cold. It has not had nourishment for a long time. We imagine ourselves studying it as we would study a lover, which is to say, our attention is completely rooted. We cannot seem to draw our attention away from our soul, even for an instant. We will use every breath to give it life. Our attention must not stray, must not wander. Our feelings toward this soul are very important. It will warm according to our love, our adoration, devotion, our radiance to it. So, okay, we warm the soul by setting ourselves on fire, a deep, slow alchemical fire, feeding the soul with our own precious life force. So, and then it continues on. It's very good. It's a very good thing to do, because I believe it's something that can have a practical effect. I mean, beyond what it's saying to do, you can use this exercise as a template to warm the soul of the world that you're in, or different aspects of it. Obviously not in as detailed way as the exercise is given, but a lot of these exercises and rituals, if we happen to do it, they're not just confined to when we're doing the particular exercise. They can become part of like our bag of tricks that we can pull out at different appropriate moments and use temporaneously, spontaneously. So an example I'll give regarding a sort of modification of this exercise, and just before I give that example, I'll say that in the exercise is sort of a different way of using the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, which is that's like a fundamental Hermetic principle. And it sort of has a way, it's also connected with making models, with making a model of something and then regarding that model as if it is the thing itself. So in this example of this exercise, we used a ball of clay as a model for the universe. Now, in the movie, another great movie, I'm not sure if it's on the list, but I've heard EJ talk about it, is called Men in Black. And in Men in Black, the universe is carried on the necklace of a cat. And so they're using, the way I look at it, they're using a cat as a model for the universe. So if you have a cat, you can use it as a model for something. Like if you wanted to try to direct some of your special kind of attention toward, say, Ukraine, where there's a lot of hardship going on, you could model your, you could try to model your cat as representing the entirety of Ukraine, etc. But the example that I was going to give is if you happen to be driving too fast and you get caught by a police officer, which of course has never happened to me. It happened to a friend. And so he's coming out to write you a speeding ticket. And, you know, the environment, this is part of our world. All of a sudden, this sort of different presence is coming into our world. And you can, if you have the presence of mind to invoke your presence, to sort of not be overwhelmed by the situation and not, you know, have your associative mind running off, have it, if you're doing the popcorn exercise or whatever, or just focusing your attention on being present, you can regard the cop as the same way you did as that ball of clay. That cop is a whole cosmos, a world in itself. It's not your world, but it's part of your world now. It's overlapping. And you can regard the cop with that same kind of loving, you know, those higher emotions, and just, you know, acknowledge the being he is. The in Sanskrit, I believe it's called namaste, which is the being in me honors the being in you, and turn the whole bummer of getting a speeding ticket into something else, into an interaction, into an encounter where in some ways this random person of the public is having an interaction with a school. And if it really works, you know, he might not write you the ticket, might just give you a warning or something like that. But this is a way of taking some of these basic exercises, because I believe teachers like EJ and others, they don't give you everything. It's not like, here, this is how you live life, go and do it. They're giving you like kind of fragments and pieces of it, pieces of the puzzle or threads that you are then encouraged to take and make your own and do with it what you will. That's what the Order of the Golden Dawn did with all these medieval alchemical manuscripts. Anyway, it's probably toward the end of my time, and I want to reserve a few minutes for any questions. And I apologize for being a little bit all over the place. I kind of had a lot to talk about, and I wasn't sure how to put it all together. One thing I was going to say at the beginning that I forgot to mention was that the character of Sherlock Holmes, did I talk about Sherlock Holmes? No. The character of Sherlock Holmes, or just being a detective in general, is a Hermetic symbol. You'll find it in Robert Anton Wilson's writings. You'll find it in other writers like Vladimir Nabokov and Thomas Pynchon, people who write in the Hermetic style. Sherlock Holmes, because the power of attention, the power of observation, of, you know, Sherlock Holmes is given at first, and EJ has recommended watching all the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films. So it's very much part of the Hermetic aspect of the Institute. But Sherlock Holmes is given a mystery, what seems to ordinary people as an unsolvable or just one, you know, a mystery or a problem beyond comprehension. And then we watch as he puts the different clues together to form a solution to this problem. And that's very much a metaphor for our problem of trying to communicate with the heart for ourselves and for others. One of the first times it was the first time I came to the Institute in 1990 for a pre-convention workshop. And I had an initial birthday question. I changed it when I met EJ, but it was on my 31st birthday, and the whole group was gathered at dinner, and I was encouraged to ask it. And my question was very intellectual, but it came down to how do we navigate in the bardos? And one of the answers I got came from Claude, and he recommended the movie They Might Be Giants, which is, again, another very good movie on the movie list. And it's about Sherlock Holmes, or someone who thinks that he's Sherlock Holmes, trying to solve this problem and seeing signs. And so you can see an example of how someone is putting these signs together to solve a problem. Okay, I'll shut up for now. I've probably gone over, and if there's any questions, I'd love to hear them.